Hello everybody, welcome to The Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music both new and old. And today it is time for Some Stuff I Missed, in which I go down some stuff I missed. Not all the stuff I missed, but some of it. Well, I appear to have made the mistake of reviewing 30 releases in the same video again, though 5 of those are just EPs. And for the first time since Volume 1, everything is from this year. I don't think this is gonna turn out to be a 2-hour video like Volume 4 was. The script is only a few pages longer than the last two, and this did come together pretty smoothly and quickly. Anyway, hoping you find something that catches your interest and don't feel like you need to watch the whole thing in one go. Though I've tried my absolute best to make sure this video doesn't drag, so you could sit through all of it at once if you wanted to. Oh yeah, and if you want to know my favorite or least favorite tracks, I have a Pastebin document listing those, linked in the description as usual. Anyway, let's get into it. Starting out with Jon Hopkins' Music for Psychedelic Therapy. I half wanted to do a proper video on this one since it is technically his newest main studio album, and projects like Insides, Immunity, and Singularity have all felt like big events in the past, but there's barely anything to say about this one at all. It's his attempt at a straight ambient project, and the results are pretty much exactly what you would expect them to be. Obviously, it's extraordinarily pretty, loads of light and uplifting washes of ambient synths and occasional piano textures. There's a number of highlights that stuck out to me, from the mix of light pads and field recordings in the 3-part Taos Caves Ecuador, of which the 3 parts are barely distinguishable from one another. You get the marginally more epic builds of Deep in the Glowing Heart, the delicate piano excursions of Ascending Dawn Sky, and the emotional powerhouse piano ballad finish that is Sit Around the Fire, featuring motivational spoken word from the late Ram Dass, which is a surprisingly heartfelt addition that doesn't feel pretentious or out of place. And all the other tracks I didn't mention are still really nice too. If you wanted the usual well-detailed and well-textured sonic experience of beats and synths Jon Hopkins is known for delivering, this ain't it. This feels a lot more like a side project, but it's not really trying to be anything game-changing either, and even if I doubt I'm going to be coming back to this much in the future, it's still definitely got enough value and emotional resonance to merit giving a shot. So I'll give it a 7.3 out of 10. Next up from GRiZ, Rainbow Brain. GRiZ is an artist I've known about for ages. I first found out about him through his participation in Pretty Lights A Color Map of the Sun remix album, and he's always been pretty closely connected to that crowd and collabs with a lot of similar people, delivering his own brand of electro-funk with his own saxophone playing that's gained quite a bit more traction than many of his contemporaries on the scene. With that said, I'll freely admit I never properly listened to any of his other previous albums in full, and still haven't, mainly thanks to my off-and-on burnout with pretty much all the artists in this particular scene who aren't Michael Menert. I've been around to see this guy's last 3 album cycles for Say It Loud, Good Will Prevail, and Ride Waves, and in all 3 cases I briefly previewed through the albums and was just like, I'm kinda sick of this style right now, he doesn't stick out to me as special enough. I think too much of his stuff reminded me of the material that actually got me burned out on this style to begin with, from artists like Grammatic and Manic Focus. But still, when I saw this album existed, I did get mildly interested enough to give it a full shout out of curiosity, and after hearing it, yeah, it's fine. Kind of reconfirmed the experience I expected to get when I previewed through his old albums. None of the gazillion interludes add anything worth mentioning, and there are a number of 2013-style modern dubstep tracks that strike me as kind of an obnoxious headache to get through, like Astrofunk, Burn Up the Floor, and especially the title track. Jesus, I was not a fan of the title track. I know I may have given props to the similar sounding material from that last Must Die album, but that album worked for me as much as it did because the production and mastering was way better than average for this style, and I noted that it likely would have been a really irritating listen if not for that. Those lower moments on this album with their much more average production level are a good example of how this could have gone wrong and are pretty tedious to get through. With that said, while there's nothing on this album I love and a decent chunk that was a turnoff like that, it does still have quite a bit to like. The continuous mix is really seamless and well executed, and there are a pretty decent amount of moments that go for like a marginally less abrasive and more melodic approach that did work markedly better for me. Like Vibe Check, Tie-Dye Sky, that whole 4-track run from Harmony to Other Side of Jupiter. Those are all really good. Thought the sax soloing on Infinite was really fun, and Another World was a particularly strong and expansive sounding ending where the experience was actually starting to live up to the album cover a little bit. It's a perfectly alright album. I can totally see the appeal. I just don't really see myself hanging on to it, so I guess I'm giving this a 6.5 out of 10. Next up from RP Boo, Established. RP Boo is a Chicago producer often credited as among the originators of the genres of footwork, juke, and ghetto house, even so far as to be called the equivalent to those genres what Juan Atkins was to techno. He's been at it since the early 90s, though he didn't get his due recognition until being signed to Planet Mu in 2013 and regularly putting out albums on there, this latest one being his fourth. I haven't listened to his other ones in full aside from maybe some isolated previews, but the bits I heard sounded pretty similar to what he did here. His style is mostly characterized by minimal drum machine beats and simple chopped up samples, usually isolated from rap songs. Very little to it, but he's definitely made a name for himself making this kind of material, right down to this album sounding like something that would have circled around underground clubs in the early mid-90s. Now, I don't know if it's an easy one to recommend to anyone who isn't as interested in the history of dance music. While I do generally like this album for what it is ridiculously stripped back and simplistic, and derives most of its appeal from its super gritty style and the way it evokes the feeling of being in some dingy underground club in a dangerous neighborhood in the west side of Chicago, and underscoring people having furious dance-off battles. And it is absolutely an acquired taste. One of these tracks chops up a super blatant sample of Dr. Dre's Ain't Nothing But a G Thing in a really basic way. Another is totally focused around a repetitive sample of someone shouting wrong N-word to fuck with. If you told me this was really boring, thin on ideas, or even banal, I would get it. But I don't know, I kind of enjoy how it immerses itself so deeply in its surrounding culture and retro dance textures. No one can say the experience is inauthentic in any capacity. Also, while I do feel like this album has a fairly uninteresting opening stretch, once we get to the track All Over, he really starts to deliver lots of gems in a row as he starts incorporating a few soul samples. Just like that's repetitive chops of "it was at that moment he knew he fucked up." Those were pretty funny. And the closer, Another Night to Party, delivers such undeniable energy with its peppy sampling and is the easy highlight on this thing for me. I don't think it's an absolute must listen, it probably won't be for everyone, and I don't think it'll even be a long-term keeper for me, but I still definitely enjoyed it for what it was, and I do have to put some respect on this guy's name, so I will give this a 7.3 out of 10. Next up from Phaeleh, Soma. Phaeleh is the alias for Bristol downtempo / dubstep producer Matt². And when I say dubstep, I mean like the OG Burial or Mala type dubstep that took heavy influence from UK garage and was still trying to evoke dubby two-step. Although Preston's take on the genre is a lot more polished and meant to feel relaxing and refreshing, it mostly would disqualify as downtempo. I'd never heard of him before getting a blind recommendation in my comments and plopping him into here, so on a whim I decided he's gonna be one of the guys I'll check out the fuller back catalog of and do a mini and brief segment on, so here's my quick thoughts on his previous main studio albums. Alright, this is my shit. It's like a deconstruction of sounds from the ground luminal formulas of dubby, downtempo, and trip hop, approached from a different angle and with totally different influences, but with a similar final effect. It's all around excellent, if maybe containing like 2 redundant tracks near the end that could have been cut. Probably his best effort overall. Like the last album, but less memorable, less varied, and better paced. Obligatory ambient project, it's nice. Another mostly ambient one, and holy crap, why is this 90 minutes? Returns to his usual sound, but with more thicker electronic tones, one of his better ones. Basically just tides again. Which brings us to here. So yeah, I like Phaeleh. He definitely sits firmly within my usual wheelhouses, and while most of his stuff kind of reads to me as background music and I wish there was more I properly loved, the production on all his albums is consistently outstanding, and I can't deny he does have a couple of projects that could really hit that level for me. And I think that might also include this latest project he came out with this past October. Soma may not be anything you haven't already heard from him before, but yeah, maybe it's recency bias, but I do think it just so happened to be one of the best iterations of his usual sound to date. Not quite as good as Fallen Light, still could have used a bit more variety to hit that level, but this album does once again have better pacing, as even if not every track here sticks out to me as something special, there aren't any where I feel inclined to hit the skip button, and it sits at a nice, respectable, and fulfilling 51 minutes, not too long or too short. Honestly, this would be a pretty good starting point for those looking to get into him, since it does clearly demonstrate what he's all about, i.e. beautiful melodic production and densely layered sound design. I really like the continuing groove created by that whole opening stretch from the opener to, let's say, Elemental. Introspection is an excellent attention-grabbing opener and probably the best track in the bunch, with Okab as its more electronic and slightly more abstract companion. I think the album's closing stretch of more stripped-back compositions finishes this thing out pretty strongly too, with a cut of minimal dub techno and Equinox dub, a beautiful piano-guitar duet in Tantalus, and fairly meandering but still quite peaceful finisher Elysian Fields that occasionally incorporates some Boards of Canada-esque tones. Even the ambient interludes are nice and don't tank the pacing. I like how there's just a minute-long cut called Imbira, where he plays the Imbira. It's neat. If I do take issue with anything, it's some of those more middling taiko-ish cuts around the middle, like Dusk and Polar, that blend into the background. But even these are fine and don't drag for me. The whole album is really freaking nice and just puts me in a good mood. And I don't really know what else to say about it aside from I can definitely hang on to it and hold it up as one of the better down-tempo releases I've heard this year, so yeah, I think I can give this a solid 8 out of 10. Next up from Meemo, Neon Genesis, Soul into Matter². Meemo, is the alias for producer Lara Rix Martin, who previously was one half of the duo Heterotic, the other half of which was none other than Mike Paradinas. And while I don't think he was involved in this album's creation in any capacity, he did promote it on Twitter, and he is why I know about it. We'll get to him more later. But yeah, Rix Martin has been doing her/their own stuff on Planet Mu for a few years. Sorry, I don't know which pronouns to use. They have a few other albums out on the label, which I have not listened to, but I was particularly intrigued by this album, which was a concept album simultaneously inspired by the anime Neon Genesis Evangelion, obviously, given the title. Also the soundtrack to Ghost in the Shell, combined with their recent fascination with Jewish mysticism and religious texts. He was raised Jewish and apparently was reading the Talmud while coming up with the idea for this album. And a lot of the song titles have very Jewish-sounding names, which I'm not going to try to pronounce. The album is sort of an abstract exploration into Jewish identity as well as her own identity as non-binary. And if you guess that this album would be a total mindfuck that I wouldn't really know what to make of, well, yeah, pretty much. A lot of this album, especially the first half, is taken up by weird experimental ambient compositions that I suppose utilize some kind of synthesized religious choir and totally screw them up to sound intentionally odd and unpleasant, which while I get the symbolic meaning of, still aren't especially fun to get through. But at the same time, there's also some cuts that have much more straightforward science fiction synth melody approaches, and even two that just straight up focused on regular amen breaks. There's also some kind of thin, synthwave-ish pieces, odd footwork-inspired compositions with incomprehensible blends of percussion and chopped-up vocal samples, and ends in a fairly straightforward piano composition, too. This album's got everything but the kitchen sink in it, and while all of it does make some kind of sense symbolically and conceptually, it does lead to a pretty damn disjointed experience that leaves me scratching my head more often than not, which was probably the point. I think my thoughts on this aren't too far from my thoughts on Arca's most recent material, as in I don't really personally connect with it much, but I do respect how it occupies its own experimental lane and how personal its explorations are to the artists making it. This stuff does clearly carry a lot of weight and meaning for Meemo, and I can see it connecting a lot more with other people. And this album is much less abrasive than Kick 1, so take that all as you will. Even if it's probably not for me, I can definitely recommend giving it a shot. You're not going to get anything like it elsewhere, so yeah, I think this gets a strong 6.7 out of 10 for me. Next up from Virtual Riot, Simulation. Well, in the last volume I covered Must Die, so now I'm covering another well-acclaimed modern dubstep/electro house artist who's often mentioned in the same sentence. I'll freely admit that this is my first time listening to a full project from this guy, despite knowing he's existed since that Throwback EP a few years ago, but hey, better late than never. Now, in one breath, I'm less impressed with this album than I was with Crisis Vision. Must Die made a great album out of some styles and ideas that I might have found insufferable in the hands of a less talented producer. And Virtual Riot sits more within the kind of material in this genre I've never had trouble getting into. This album sounds like a number of artists on the scene back in its heights in 2014 and 2015. Tracks like So Sorry and Toho Rhythm, with all their chopped up voice samples from Team Fortress 2, kind of remind me of Knife Party's Resistance, for example. But hey, even if it's not nearly as novel an experience for me, I won't complain. It's still all pretty dang solid for what it is. And the production is similarly really well balanced and sounds really good. The drops on this album all act as satisfying payoffs to their build-ups and never feel pulled out of left field. Every track bangs. The whole album has that same goofy veneer of just having a good time without taking itself that seriously that I always liked out of this genre's best material. I don't really have a lot of specifics to break down. It's not the most well-varied experience. I suppose I gravitated towards some of the more melodic tracks like Don't Worry, Chroma, and Rewrite, or a few of those poppier cuts near the end like Back in Time, Dreaming, and especially Neon Angel. And away from some of the marginally more abrasive cuts like Getaway or Exile, even if I did really like Fork Funeral. But honestly, my thoughts on all 16 of these tracks are pretty much the same. There's no track here that really stuck out as a giant standout that got knocked out of the park, but there's also no duds or cuts that I thought flat out didn't work, and despite running on for an hour, I never felt like it dragged or felt the urge to skip tracks. I don't think it's memorable enough to keep around longer term, but I certainly don't mind the idea of coming back to it, and it absolutely did make my day a little better as a nice little collection of electro house comfort food, I guess. So take that all as you will. It's just a fun listen. So I'll give it a 7.5 out of 10. Next up, from Carbon-Based Lifeforms, Stochastic. Yeah, Carbon-Based Lifeforms released an out-of-nowhere 95-minute all-ambient studio album that immediately disappeared from everyone's consciousness like the day after it dropped. And I can in fact confirm that it is a thing that exists. I mean, it's hard to go wrong with these guys' style, which we already know plays well into this genre, but it is greatly overshadowed by a better and tighter all-ambient project they'd released years ago called 23. I think that one was much more intentionally crafted and varied, while this one is apparently created by more random generative methods, I guess. The final effect isn't too different. This one's just much less interesting and sounds pretty much exactly the same throughout its entire running time. Aside from maybe the track Stockhouse, which has these weird rumbling effects I wasn't a fan of. As far as monolithic drone projects go, you could do worse. It is a pleasant enough listen that is recognizable as their style, but I have a lot higher expectations from these guys than what this delivers. If you want CBL bringing their A game on the level of their material from when they were still on Ultimate Records, this will not be up to snuff. And for a project of this length, it's kinda hard to argue this was truly worth the commitment. It's fine, but you wouldn't be missing much if you skipped it either, so I think I'm overall feeling a strong 5.7 out of 10. Next up, from Voljum, Dayscapes EP. Alright, here's the part of this volume where I go through some EPs, starting with this nice little 4-track experience that's been getting a decent bit of traction from Voljum. Yeah, this sounds almost exactly like Haywire's Twofold albums. It's a mix of glitchy modern electro house and complextro with sprightly and textured horn-driven jazz arrangements. But Twofold is great, and I can't complain about hearing more material like that. You are getting lots of hyper-dense experiences that have something interesting going on every passing second. I think my favorite cut on here was Anemoi, as it had a much more cinematic and complex, upscale type IDM approach to its sound. But they're all pretty solid. Anytime those kind of big bandish jazz arrangements came in, especially on the first 2 tracks, I was pretty sold on it. And the final cut, Half Overcast, has some vocal integrations which I'm ambivalent on, but it's also got some cool bits with pianos and amen breaks. This whole EP is some good stuff, so check it out if you haven't yet. This gets a 7.5 out of 10 for me. Next up, from Machinedrum, Psyconia EP. Also got a 6-track EP from Machinedrum as a companion to his A View of You album that I reviewed at the end of last year, and this got some buzz in its own right. I don't think this stuff is quite as memorable or attention-grabbing as the stuff he was doing on the album proper, but this is certainly just as diverse and would have fit nicely alongside that material. Got a nice, well-polished drum and bass pop crossover with Angelica and another that has more guitars and features Jorge Elbrecht from Japanese Breakfast. Got a gritty but chill hip-hop cut outlining rapper De Niro Ferrar's life in the streets. Got two skittery and spacey IDM-leaning cuts, one of which features Chrome Sparks. And it ends in one last cut with lots of slow-building melodic arpeggios that are pretty epic and sound like they're about to lead into some big EDM drop, but instead just shoot off into hard-hitting amen breaks. This is very nice. I mean, I don't think any of this is absolutely essential to hear. It does read to me as a bunch of B-sides that I'm probably not going to revisit, but I did definitely like all 6 tracks here. And if you liked A View of You and wanted more material like what showed up on that album, it'll do well for you. It's nice. So, solid 7 out of 10. Next up from Wayward, Sapphire Eyes EP. Wayward have a pretty solid lock on my year-end list with their Waiting for the World album, so I've since looked into a few of their old EPs and singles they've put out over the years, and they do have quite a few gems in their catalog. Their most popular track, Transients from 2017, is a really neat jazzy downtempo cut. Their debut single, Love Jones, and the cut Time and Again from their Green Lanes EP have fantastic soul-sampling house grooves. Their entire Ugestu EP from 2014 was flat out excellent, and that EP's opening cut, Phaeleh, especially blew me out of the water. The quality of their album does not appear to have been a one-off fluke. With that said, they do have some forgettable material too, and this latest EP released as a companion to their album unfortunately falls within that camp. I do like the more atmospheric blend of the title track and the deep bassy grooves of Camden Road, but wasn't really a fan of the rambly spoken word they put over it. And while I did like The Cause and Run Out of Love more for their thicker club beats and faster pace, they also didn't really stick with me as much as I wanted. I mean, the EP's perfectly fine for what it is, but I guess hearing some of their other stuff set my expectations higher. We'll still be looking forward to whatever they release next, but this particular collection's nothing you absolutely need to go out of your way for, so 6.3 out of 10, I guess. Next up from William Orbit, Starbeam EP. Damn, William Orbit came back with his first new music since like 2014 or something. This guy's definitely worth looking into. Been a fan for a minute through his Strange Cargo album series and Pieces in a Modern Style and all that stuff. He produced Madonna's Ray of Light album. He's pretty cool. I really need to go back and re-listen to his stuff. I hadn't thought about him in a long time. This particular thing is a pretty standard release you'd hear out of the Anjuna Deep label. Progressive house adjacent material with some retro 90s textures. But there's definitely fun stuff in that mold. The pianos on tracks like the title track and Diso may be pretty obviously synthesized presets, but the same can be said for classic tracks like Water from a Vine Leaf. And they do sound really nice, especially how they cascade over each other on Diso, or how they form the core groove without any drums on the title track. I also like the slower thumping down-tempo beats of a cut like Wordsworth and how they explore some marginally more abstract textures. And the track featuring the vocals of Lido Pimienta is a highlight too. She's a particularly nice addition to the mix, going over trance beats and break beats. I mean, this is nothing really special in the grander scheme of things, and I'm probably not going to remember it exists, but I don't know, I had fun with it for what it is. So this can still get away with a solid 7 out of 10. Next up from Tipper, Insolito EP. I've gotten the impression that Tipper EPs are kind of like Outakar EPs in that a lot of people care specifically about them, occasionally above the actual albums, and many will say you don't have a complete view of his discography without them. At least that's the impression I get, since a lot of the comments on my Judgement Mind Hatch review were just complaining to me about how they weren't included in that Videos and Brief segment. Which won't act like that didn't irritate me at the time. But I will admit, as I heard on the likes of Flunked and Lattice, his EPs do tend to explore a pretty different side to his sound that leans more on glitch hop and maybe experimental dubstep. And I can see why they picked up this separate hype in their own right as his up-tempo material compared to the more down-tempo focus of his more recent albums. And they appear to be equally strange and abstract with just as much effort put into them. Now, this latest particular EP is not in the same boat as his other ones. This is basically just more stuff in the same vein as Forward Escape and Judgement Mind Hatch. though this stuff does have a bit more of a groove and an edge than the stuff on the main album it's following up. Honestly, I might even enjoy it a slight bit more than Jettison Mind Hatch itself. Certainly didn't drag or run together as much as that album did. Now, to be fair, my favorite moment here was probably just the extended version of C'est La Vie, called C'est La VIP. That was one of the better tracks on the main album, and while this version doesn't sound that different as far as I can tell, just being placed in this different context does highlight its strengths a lot better. Really cool manipulations of old-timey samples and their chord progressions that help make it stand out. And the other tracks are all good too. I really like the stuttered organs acting as a drop on Diapaused, and the refreshing drum and bass mix on Closer's Sin Banshee. Air Biscuits was a cool atmospheric opener with some cool bass work in one part. Moriscos was a neat track that sits in between modern dubstep and OG dubstep formulas with its wobbly bass drops. And Up Trick had some cool melodic cascades as well. I mean, if you want something with more of a hook that'll stick in your head, this will not deliver. Not that Tipper's ever really been about that, but yeah, I did like this EP a decent bit. It's another solid addition to his illustrious catalog. And I can give this a 7.3 out of 10. Next up from John Oliver, Tau 23 Tempo. No relation to the talk show host, this is an obscure Canadian ambient modern classical artist that got recommended once on the official Bandcamp Twitter, and may or may not have an audience comparable in size to that of my own music. I kind of doubt this segment is going to massively change that, but I do think this is a pretty neat little ambient project. Definitely more interesting and immersive than the carbon-based Lifeforms album I mentioned earlier. Kinda hits a similar note that the first half of Lear's Biome did, as I covered in the last volume. A project with an environmental message that starts out very peaceful and minimalistic and meditative, and gets progressively darker as the project carries on as symbolism for the forest being chopped down, right down to the track The Peril sampling what sounds like actual field recordings of, like, power saws and deforestation. Or maybe it's synth imitations thereof, I don't actually know. Though despite the similarity in concept, obviously this album doesn't make a turn towards techno halfway through like Biome did. It's all ambient, but the 7 tracks here do all have clear identities apart from each other. It does have a few moments that kinda drag. Forest Voices was a fairly lackluster dark drone piece, and Closer singing Acacia, while making for a haunting yet optimistic finish to this thing with its brighter and higher pitched textures, didn't feel like a major standout to me. But the 11-minute Tree Spirit, with its evolving explorations through windy field recordings, strange drones and synth effects, and eventually a twinkling rhythmic progression at the end, is pretty consistently engaging. The dark synth excursions of Anteater and Ancient Giant Song were both really well textured and nailed their mood and sense of environment. The former has a surprising amount of progression over its 4.5-minute length. But the biggest star of the show for me was probably the melted strings and flutes on Slow Forest. They sound absolutely gorgeous and have some really melancholy and emotionally investing chord progressions. This whole album's a pretty interesting listen for sure, and while I don't know if it's exactly a mind-blowing experience or one of my favorites of the year, it definitely deserves more attention than it's gotten. Give it a shot. I'm feeling a 7.5 out of 10 on it. But while we're on the topic of artists with very small audiences, albeit from the complete opposite end of the spectrum, next up from Park Zero, Something They Can Dance To. So this is a project I found out through a review video from Buffalo Staple, apparently coming from an artist typically known for making harsh noise material, taking a turn into something much more dance-friendly, as you may have guessed from the album title. If this were like not even 2 years ago, I don't know if I would have even given this the time of day. As I've established many times over, I tend not to be much of a harsh noise guy. And I won't deny the distortion that swallows up pretty much everything in this project is not always to my taste, but I still did actually turn out to enjoy this thing quite a bit for what it is. For the most part, the noisiness and intensity of these compositions don't prevent them from still containing solid danceable grooves. Obviously, this stuff is very intentionally frightening sounding, and a lot of the textures have a very screechy, mechanical texture to them. And there's a lot of tracks where these cuts just have these glitchy panning effects, where my left headphone especially starts to sound like it's going on the blink. And when we get to the penultimate cut, The Dreaming, the ridiculously heavy distortion does actively start to cut into the grooves a bit. That one had the potential to sound like demon-possessed Jon Hopkins or something and be a major highlight, but the bass got completely obliterated and it's a lot less satisfying than it could have been. But the rest of this thing is actually pretty kick-ass. From the screeching drill and bass breakbeats of Opener Check It Out, to the closer The End, which sounds like the harsh noise equivalent to an old Crystal Method cut. My favorite cut here is probably Angel Sang. Really like the industrial beat and acid bass line paying off into those distorted 90s pop singer samples. Feels like a pretty coherent and satisfying build-up and drop. Side-Eye reminds me of the beginning of Oudiker's Rex On, with its crashing hip-hop beat and thick but minimal bass line, and the way The Siren utilizes a similar traditional breakbeat over its wailing, distorted ambient chords. That was pretty dang cool. Would I probably like this album more if it were less distortion-heavy? Well, probably, yeah. Would be nice to be able to hear some of these sounds in better detail and not get crushed into oblivion. But I wouldn't want all the distortion taken away. It feels like these breakbeat formulas I'm used to hearing being approached from a different angle that I'm a lot less familiar with, but still being executed well. And heavy distortion does often really fit with the tone of the actual music on display. Maybe projects like these could even be sprouting the seeds for me to get into a regular noise project someday, who knows. But in the meantime, yeah, I quite enjoyed this. 7.5 out of 10. Next up, from Wooden Flowers, Diffused Light. Gotta give a quick shout to this little side mini album, which is a collab between Michael Menard and Adam Tenenbaum, and it is almost certainly the freakiest and most experimental effort the former has worked on, at least that I've heard. Lots of strange, off-the-wall beats that show a bit of dubstep influence occasionally, especially disorienting on Opener Sunspot, some brighter and funkier soundings that lighten the mood on an occasional moment like Chromesthesia, but also lots of freaky blaring psych rock noise guitars as seen on tracks like Everything Is Fine, and lots of formless synth ambience, especially as focused on the 9-minute closer Leaves. I will admit that this isn't one of my biggest favorite things Menard's put out lately. I had a lot more fun with the double EP he'd put out with James 2 as Mossy Projects earlier this year. This can get a bit heavy and disorienting and maybe be more the kind of thing I need to be in the right mood for. Kinda doubt it's gonna get a lot of replay value longer term. But hey, it's definitely an interesting listen that has just as many uplifting bright spots as dark ones, and the production is as impressive as always. I'd say it's still worth giving a shot if it's caught your interest, so strong 6.7 out of 10 on it. Next up from Rüfüs Du Sol, Surrender. You got me begging, baby. Rüfüs Du Sol is the super popular Australian indie dance trio of vocalist Tyrone Lindqvist, keyboardist John George, and drummer James Hunt. These guys regularly top the iTunes electronic charts with all their albums, mostly their 2016 album Bloom. They deliver very smooth, if very formulaic, blends of atmospheric deep house that kind of remind me of You, instrumentally if not vocally. I'll admit I wasn't really a fan of Bloom itself. Almost felt like I was listening to the exact same song 11 times over on that one. Though I did like their 2014 debut Atlas a fair bit more, with its slightly more stripped-back house sounds that had more textural variety. And Solace in 2018 had a bit more of a louder stadium-friendly feel to it, with the lead singer sounding more like Chris Martin from Coldplay. I don't know. I guess they're alright. I have gone on record not being huge on these particular kinds of commercial indie dance and house bands in years previous, but none of these guys' stuff has been like an active turnoff for me either. They just kind of exist, I guess. As for this latest album, I will admit I was almost a little caught off guard by how hard a lot of these tracks went. They had already started going in this direction on their last album, but it's more pronounced here. Most of these tracks have build-ups that kind of sound middling and like their usual fare, but then pay off in drops that have a lot more energy and punchiness to them. Take the second track, Make It Happen, for instance. In the first minute or so, I was pretty checked out and thinking, this is just kind of average indie pop. But then there's suddenly a switch up into this thumping house beat with this thick bass line and kids choir that comes from out of nowhere, and I'm like, this actually kind of sounds badass. I'm used to EDM tracks where I like the build-ups and get let down by the drops. I don't often run into meh build-ups that get redeemed by their drops. Now, I'm still not crazy about this project as a whole, and that primarily comes down to, I think, Rüfüs Du Sol's style, both as producers and performers, falls a bit too much on the generic indie side for my liking without much unique personality. The lead singer isn't all that expressive or interesting a presence either. Whenever he's just singing over some of the more chill sections, those are always my least favorite parts of the album, and the parts where I tend to check out. I Don't Want to Leave and The Closer Always are probably the two biggest offenders. The latter was a pretty disappointing ending that left this project on a particularly underwhelming note for me. Also, how did they take the singer from Basement Jaxx's Hush Boy and get her to sound like an anonymous airy background voice? But that said, there are quite a few isolated moments that did really stick with me as being particularly good. I really liked Next to Me and its use of those plinky pianos and those bleepy leads on the drops that give it a more alien feel, I guess, I don't know. See You Again Since were satisfyingly thick with some neat dramatic bass stabs, and the use of Ula Malenga's voice went over way better than on The Closer. She has a much punchier and more soulful presence here. Devotion could have passed as a solid trance cut and as one of Lindqvist's most impassioned performances. Sorry if I got the pronunciation wrong. The building pianos on Wildfire were really dramatic and investing, and damn, On My Knees was great. Got way more of a dark and foreboding presence and more punch and weight than maybe any track I've heard from these guys to date. And probably the best hook as well. I think its status as the most popular cut in the bunch is well deserved. Did get a little thrown off by those elephant sound effects, but they got that to work too. And I will also have to give a shout out to Alive Reprise. Even if Alive itself isn't one of my big favorites, I did like the atmospheric pads it had. And I just appreciated that they just randomly set aside 40 seconds to just isolate those pads and make a little ambient interlude out of it. It's a nice touch. I like how they did that. I am left feeling like this album as a whole is very much a mixed bag. Some of these tracks I thought were really good and others here just elicited shrugs. I'm not going to be hanging onto it beyond this video. I think it either needed a bit of more unique flavor or at least deliver more consistent standouts to be something I'd want to come back to. But I do feel like there is something here. I do feel like I get why this might have resonated more with others and gotten all the traction that it has, so I guess I'll also give it a strong 6.7 out of 10. It's not bad. Next up from Ross from Friends, Tread. Got a new one from the Giraffe from Madagascar. I mean, the British producer Felix Weatherall, who's been signed to Brainfeeder for a minute. I do remember his debut album, Family Portrait, getting some buzz back in 2018, though it passed me by at the time since I wasn't doing these roundups yet. Haven't listened to that one in full, but this one got some positive reviews that I saw, so I plopped it in here. And yeah, this is a pretty alright little collection of atmospheric, deep house, and UK garage adjacent stuff with some neat soul sampling in there for good measure. It's really not the most interesting or engaging stuff I've heard in this mold. It's hitting a lot of similar notes to that last Bicep album, but like that album, I thought it was pretty decent. There are admittedly a fair few cuts that lean on the more straightforward or even ambient leaning, like Revelers or Run, that left me kinda checked out and fell into the background. But the cuts with the soul samples did much of the heavy lifting, like the opener The Daisy, or Life in a Mind, or the whole run from A Brand New Start through to Spatter/Splatter. I think my two favorite cuts here were XXX Olympiad and Grub. I like the way they built into each other and how their samples were worked into their atmospheric grooves, also how the latter had that neat little piano outro. I was left wishing I could get more enthusiastic about any of this. I feel like I've already heard no shortage of material in this exact vein this year, and it really didn't stick out from the crowd as much as I hoped it would. But I suppose you could also do worse than this. It's fine. Like a solid 6 out of 10. Next up from Rezz, Spiral. Alright, Rezz is still doing her thing with her third album that happens to not only be her first to be released on RCA Records instead of Mousetrap, but it's also the most album-like so far, with a solid 11 tracks at 35 minutes compared to the much shorter 8-track lineups of her previous two efforts. Not much has fundamentally changed since her debut, still exploring the same dark and bassy blends of techno and modern dubstep that are equal parts experimental and commercial. Though she did bring on more vocal guests this time, go for a much poppier approach on a good handful of these tracks. And I was surprised by how well that approach worked into her style. A lot of these tracks like Sacrificial and Paper Walls and Out of My Head have particularly strong hooks to back themselves up, but are still just as hard-hitting as you'd want any Rezz production to have, with strong drops that act as well-executed payoffs. Paper Walls in particular was the clear highlight of the album for me. Though she does still have time for tracks in her usual less commercial bass-heavy style like Chemical Bond, Spun, and Vortex that typically goes over well too. Vortex definitely being my favorite of those. Though a few of these did turn out to be lower points, like Levitate, which had a less satisfying drop, or Time, which oddly had thinner production than everything else here. Also, while I liked the closer, Breathe, I did think it ended really abruptly. I mean, while I don't think this album is so special where I see myself hanging on to it longer term, I wouldn't be against the idea of coming back to it, and definitely enjoyed myself through most of the experience. It's a fun listen for what it is. So I'll give it a 7.3 out of 10. Next up, from 10 City, Judgement. 10 City were once the Chicago house vocal trio of Byron Berg, Herb Lawson, and Byron Stingley, working under the direction of legendary producer Marshall Jefferson, now reformed as just the duo of Jefferson and Stingley. I threw this one in the lineup as it was pretty much the only marginally interesting sounding project nominated for a Grammy this year in the Best Dance Electronic Album category, which had its worst showing that I can even remember. While I'd never heard of 10 City before and don't exactly tend to trust the Grammys for music recommendations, after hearing about it I was mildly interested and threw it in here for the heck of it. 10 City are some of the OGs of classic Chicago house and had a pretty respectable tenure from the late 80s to the mid-90s before breaking up and going inactive for decades, only coming out with this comeback album earlier this year, which also features 2 remixes of their debut hit Devotion and a remake of their biggest hit That's the Way Love Is. In case you'd forgotten who they were, I guess. I didn't have particularly soaring expectations for this, but actually turns out I thought this was great. It was way more fun to listen than I had anticipated. Like, if you go back and listen to some of those classic projects, there's like Foundation, the production hasn't aged that well by today's standards, can sound kinda thin and muffled. And their later albums sound pretty dated and like a product of what sounds were popular in the time of their release. But this comeback very much addresses both issues. Still sounds like the classic material from the era they came up in, but the production is given a major facelift and sounds a lot more crisp and upfront than it ever did. Even makes this sound, which would ordinarily feel attached to a very specific moment in history, end up feeling timeless. And all the arrangements all go for the more cowbell approach of sounding really lush and organic and textured. All these grooves on top of the typical bouncy deep house beats, bass lines, and pianos also have punchy horn sections, string arrangements, gospel choruses, and it constantly sounds fantastic. The Marshall Jefferson remix of Devotion is the one moment here where the sound returns to the more old-school stripped-back house style, but that still works well too. But I was just completely floored when I heard tracks like Love Is Just a Game, Feel It Too, and especially the opener Be Free, with how they totally knocked their grooves out of the park. That opener track is like my new favorite thing ever. And then there's Stingley as a singer. Even after all these years, he sounds just as good as he did 30 years ago. All his performances are excellent, sound like they would have fit right at home in the great soul and disco records of the 70s, and he's still nailing every single high note he hits. Now, is it probably a cheap move for 3 of these tracks to just be their old most recognizable hits? Yeah, maybe a bit. Also, the closer, Summer of Love, was kind of funny since the lyrics are literally about how great house music's heyday was, and how the DJs played actual music, man. And they randomly give a shout out to Oakenfold of all people, which was weird, but okay. This is an album pretty much entirely centered around celebrating the band's legacy and importance to house music, which is probably why it appealed to the Grammys. If you're someone who's got a lot of nostalgia for their old material and was around to see that stuff as it was happening, I don't know if this album is really gonna, like, blow your mind outside of being the straight, blatant nostalgia trip it's going for. But I also think it works well for someone like me who'd never heard of these guys before and wanted to know why they were once a big deal. And the inclusion of their old hits with slightly better production does help in that particular way. I don't know. There's pretty much no chance these guys are actually gonna win that Grammy. I will be disappointed when the award inevitably goes to someone like Marshmello. But even so, I had way more fun with this than I expected to, and I'd say it's definitely worth giving a shot if you've missed it. This gets a solid 8 out of 10 for me. Next up from Mira Calix, Absent Origin. Alright, experimental artist Mira Calix came back with her first album in over a decade. Some of you may know her for being married to Sean Booth of Outtaker, but she has been putting out IDM albums of her own that are similarly out there and ignoring conventional structures. albeit with a very different style to them. This latest album seems to take her weird experimental take on modern classical music as seen on her last album from 2007, Eyes Set Against the Sun, and combine it with the idea of sound collage and juxtaposition of lots of disparate sounds to create something with more thematic heft out of it. Taking anything from isolated opera-ish singing and pianos and high-pitched strings, to clips of scissors and lawnmowers, to African drumming and kid singing, to lots of spoken word samples that have a particularly political and feminist edge to them. Like how the opener, A Mark of Resistance, keeps sticking in a snippet saying, "The runes came from the same source as her power." Or the track Gargle Command V, which takes samples of someone going through the letters in the word gargle and doing like some kind of out-of-order political acronym with it. G is for guilt, R is for reparations, etc. As for how that plays out from a musical standpoint, this is basically a Matmos album, like some of their early work or the first two-thirds of The Consuming Flame, where no one can deny it qualifies as music, but it's so wonky and dissonant to the point like it's almost feeling like it's trying to push that particular boundary, and the novelty of the sample sources is a big chunk of the appeal. These mixes are always very sparse, with the sounds feeling very disconnected from each other, and are very intentionally awkward and unnerving, as if they all exist within a blank white void and weren't meant to go together. It's rare for there to feel like a coherent groove is being formed, even if there's usually at least some kind of percussion pattern. Points towards the cuts that do get my foot tapping a bit. The bass line's going next to Power Tools on Bower of Bliss, the singular IDM style track with a full drum beat and synths, titled Like Jenga, only it reaches all the way to the sky and it's made of knives. The more chill drum machine and voice explorations of I'm in Love with the End, the various shifting sections of Transport Me, that the latter was probably my favorite cut here, as it just had a lot of cool stuff going on over its 5.5 minutes. And there were other moments here I thought were cool too, for instance the pianos being cut up by literal scissor sound effects on Silence is Silver. But most of this stuff just kinda left me cold, where I could respect how out of the box the sound play was, but just didn't really have anything to latch onto emotionally. It's comparable to that Meemo, album I mentioned earlier, and while I think I have more respect for this one, being more texturally out of the box and experimental, as well as exploring further reaching concepts more thoroughly and having more to digest, that project was also a bit more musically oriented and probably had more I'd want to come back to. Still, while this project wasn't really for me and I was left not really knowing what to do with it, it was definitely an interesting listen to say the least, and I can see it getting an audience who's more drawn to how weird this can get. So if this all sounds like it'd be your thing, check it out. Me personally, 6.7 out of 10. Next up from Boys Noize, +/-. Boys Noize is a German producer who's been at it since the mid-later 2000s, best known for making electro bangers, I guess. He has had some pretty high-profile guest appearances in the past. I knew about him through his appearance on Jean-Michel Jarre's Electronica 1 The Time Machine, also his remix for Daft Punk's Tron Legacy Reconfigured, and that pretty solid track he did with Skrillex that got a Grammy nomination. Those are all pretty big cosigns. Honestly, kinda surprised to find out he wasn't French, though I suppose his sound does lean more towards the mode selector side of this genre than the Ed Banger side. This is my first time listening to a full album of his, only briefly skimmed over some of his old work, and this album definitely is an album that exists. It was alright. I mean, more than anything, I'd have to call this thing a giant mixed bag. While there were a decent handful of moments that did work for me, there were just as many moments that actively grated on my nerves or just felt very mind-numbing and boring. On one hand, I did really like both of the cuts with Kelsey Lou that had a bit more of a melodic poppier slant, especially like the second half of Ride or Die when its more uplifting guitar patterns got kicked into high gear by some particularly nice skittering beat work. Also really liked Affection and how that thicker menacing electro-pop style got some 808 heavy beats to call back to the original 80s kind of electro. There were a few cuts that had particularly strong and hard-hitting grooves. The break beats on IU were neat. Greenpoint was a nice and stomping if repetitive slow burner. And the way Nude switched from jungle breakbeats to clattering headbang-worthy techno was really fun, even if it would have been a lot better off without that moaning hook from Tommy Cash wishing everyone was naked. Also, D-Tune probably stands as my favorite in the bunch. Follows the same formula of intense electro bangers that most of this album goes for, but happens to execute it in the most consistently engaging way. That said, the rest of this album left me cold more often than not. Tracks like Polarity and XYXY got really mind-numbing with their repetitive lyrics. The former less so, since it's just listing out opposite things instead of saying the word boys and girls a gazillion times. All the male vocals on this album range from mediocre to bad. There are some really tedious cuts in the back half like Express Yourself and especially Sperm that were an absolute chore to get through. And even the closer, Act 9, while I suppose I kinda liked the portentous bass stabs it had, it just kind of felt like a unpleasant slog to close this out. Also, Rico Nasty is here, and the track she appears on is neither a highlight or a lowlight, it's just there. I don't know, even if this album had its moments that could work for me, I feel like all the cuts that just struck me as dull and monotonous took up more of the project's running time and left me frustratedly ambivalent on the entire thing. Maybe you'll get into it more than me if you're a big fan of artists like Gustaffelstein. And it did have parts I liked, but as a complete whole, I just think it's okay. Like a 6.3 out of 10. Next up from Autumn of Communion, Data Space Bass. New-ish project from Lee Norris and Mick Tillage that came out back in May and actually almost made the lineup for Volume 5, but I decided against it for whatever reason. I mean, I don't really have much to say about it, but it's a pretty nice mix of sprawling, spacey ambience and experimental IDMs they can usually deliver. Perhaps this one sticks out for being one of their spookier, more offbeat and IDM-centric in a while. I don't know, but I enjoyed it about as much as I usually enjoy Autumn of Communion projects. I do kind of like how this album starts out in some of the freakiest territory of any AOC album in recent memory and progressively gets more and more welcoming as the album goes on. Starting with a cut like Space Ain't the Place did really throw me off and how bizarre and alien and dissonant everything was. But then I also liked how some of those sounds were reworked into following track Fuchs, with how that cut progresses from spooky, dissonant IDM into something with a much stronger drum machine groove and more upfront melodies. And the end of the album was probably my favorite part. The way So Slow You Fade evolves from unnerving ambience and minimal percussion into introducing these piano textures that make it sound a lot more comforting. And the closer Journey Home legit sounds like it could have been a remastered cut from like Nork and Soul Static Bureau, with those calming lo-fi pads and foot-tapping beat, and hearing that just made me very happy. The middle of the album is mostly just spooky ambience that isn't as interesting, although I do quite like the title track and find it to be quite effective in that particular mold. And the way the flow of Telepathy uses the same voice samples as the future sound of London's Among Myselves. Neat little homage there, I suppose. Whole album is quite nice. I'm glad I did come back to it and set aside the time to digest it, so 7.3 out of 10. Next up from Dynatron, Origins. Was mildly interested in this as I long ago reviewed this guy's Escape Velocity album, and even if I'm not much of a synthwave guy, I at least remember pretty solidly enjoying that album in particular. So he came out with a new album and thought, what the heck, I'll give it a shot. And turns out this thing was very fine. If nothing else, it is really well produced for what it is. The beats are punchy, the synths all sound great and deliver on those old retro Tangerine Dream textures, all sounding really well layered and detailed too. As far as this kind of 80s pastiche played completely straight goes, you could do much worse than this. But ultimately, my problem with this album is that it doesn't really have anything to offer beyond that. Compositionally, it's extremely run-of-the-mill for this genre. There's not much to distinguish these tracks apart from each other, be it any kind of melodic hook or specific texture. Maybe you got the guitars on Close Encounter, but that's about it. Also, I didn't really like those guitars. They were kind of cheesy. You gotta be really invested in the core style to get into it, and there's just nothing really to it beyond being flashy background music that I'm not gonna remember exists in a week or two. But still, even if I'm not gonna come back to this again, the production did go a long way, and it really wasn't that bad as far as background music goes. It's perfectly inoffensive and did not make my day worse. Just nothing essential either. Feeling a 6.5 out of 10 on it. But if you want a more memorable synthwave experience, next up from Eagle-Eyed Tiger, Untether, Unravel. This is one I think someone mentioned wanting to Patreon request, but no one ever showed up to actually pay for it before my backlog got too out of control and I had to close up the schedule again. So I just threw it on here instead. I had never heard of this guy before the request came in, but hey, I definitely enjoyed this project more than that Dynatron thing I just got done talking about. It's nowhere near as well produced as that one was. The sound design is a lot flatter and more lo-fi sounding compared to that one. Sounds like a 240p YouTube rip sometimes, but not to the point where it ever undercuts the sense of space it's going for. The effect is very similar to like that Naked Flames project I covered in the last volume, where the cheapness adds a little bit of its own charm, I suppose. But more importantly, the songs themselves are noticeably stronger than on the Dynatron project. Well, for the most part. There are some vocals included on this album, which I presume were being handled by the producer himself, and not gonna lie, this guy's got about the same level of vocal talent as I do. You can tell he's not comfortable with singing and is probably around my age, and my god did he derail the opener, Cosmic Comedian, with those half-mumbled hooks of, "Oh, it's a fucking joke." No offense, but, Cell Dweller you ain't. Nothing gets me invested in your grand sci-fi concept like a random dude dropping F-bombs through a vocoder. While his presence isn't quite as grating on the other tracks he appears on, the vocals do make this entire album sound a lot more amateurish than it might have otherwise. He sounds kinda awkward and nervous on the title track, and even that little bit where he pitches down his voice on Descend. Though I could put up with his vocoder-covered performance on Power On. Also helped that the atmospheric instrumental behind him was excellent, and helped it become one of the better cuts anyway. Now, in terms of the actual grooves and melodies, this still trounces that Dynatron album. These all sound great and perfectly evoke that feeling of space, which I'm not used to feeling out of this kind of Com Cruise-adjacent style. And the instrumental cuts are all great, even the interludes, like the Hologram, Captain's Orders, or Race for the Escape Pod. The latter especially had one really propulsive groove, and I kinda wish it'd stuck around longer. And the longer instrumental cuts are typically the best ones. See Fly Me to the Groove, The Last Laugh, I'm Thinking of Ending Things, all solid synthwave grooves built there. Though the best track here had to be Variations on a Harmonic Sequence. The moodier synth chords and various progressions that one went through just made me sit back and go, man, this just sounds fucking great. I do have pretty mixed thoughts on the album as a complete whole and how cheap it can sound sometimes. If it's meant to evoke the soundtrack to a sci-fi film, it's one produced by film school students with a green screen. It can definitely be hit and miss, but I cannot deny that the best moments of this album were absolutely worth the price of admission. This guy's clearly very talented when it comes to grooves and melodic composition, and that can excuse even some of the cringiest parts of this thing. The high points still outweigh how low the low points go, so I can definitely recommend giving this a shot. Not a keeper in its full entirety, but there are parts I genuinely loved right away and I might even hang on to, so I guess this is getting a very strong 7.3 out of 10 for me. Check it out! Next up from µ-Ziq and Mrs Jynx, Secret Garden. Alright, finally getting to Mike Paradinas and his new collab with Hannah Davidson, aka Mrs Jynx, who's been putting out melodic IDM projects of her own on Planet Mu for quite a while now, though I'll admit I hadn't heard of her before this was announced. Now, we did recently come off the heels of a new µ-Ziq album called Skrillex, which I reviewed and thought was pretty solid, if maybe the kind of thing you could tell probably wasn't all that high effort for him to put together. This album, however, is a bit of a different beast. It came about as Paradinas and Davidson were both recently dealing with the loss of one of their parents, and they wanted to make this kind of melancholy melodic IDM project together as a way to channel those emotions. It's definitely more ambient and down-tempo leaning than anything else in Paradinas' catalog, and it will not surprise you at all to hear that the melodies on this album are fantastic and perfectly capture that subtle melancholy and comforting tone they were going for. This project's heavy emotional background does in fact carry through in the music itself, even if the tone does also try to feel subtly optimistic as well. Now, even if this album has a lot more emotional resonance than pretty much anything Paradinas has put out in years, I still probably enjoyed this on an equal level to Skrillex, because this album is kinda lacking on the variety front. And I would have a hard time telling tracks apart from each other. Maybe some had stronger beats, maybe there's that one track near the end that has some weirdly screechy leads on it that didn't quite fit. But most of the experience of this runs together for me. Skrillex gave me more to chew on. But I didn't really care that much either, it just meant that I don't really have much to say about it in a review context. When the melodies and the emotional core at the center are this perfectly nailed, it doesn't really matter how samey the project might be. This was a really nice project to just put on and let myself sort of get lost in it, not have to think about it too hard. And it does nail exactly what it was going for. Definitely worth checking out if you've missed it. I can give this a 7.5 out of 10. Next up from Mr. Bill, Phantasmagoria. Alright, this is my first time listening to a full album from Mr. Bill. I'd known about him previously, both through that one-off track he did with Deadmau5 and the EP he did with AU5 on Upscale. Also, he's once released a track with Andrew Huang and has worked with like 50 billion other producers over the years. Now, his core style on this particular album does fall pretty cleanly within that upscale type of modern EDM/IDM hybrids that are most occupied with sound design and production detail above all else, perhaps at the expense of the deeper emotional core. Though this also kind of ended up falling in a similar camp for me as that last Hudson Lee album, where the stakes are kept relatively low, and Mr. Bill never tries to hype any of this material up to be more than what it is, just meant for having a bit of fun. In spite of how bombastic some of the drops here can occasionally get, the experience as a whole feels pretty chill and low-key. And sure, a few said drops can occasionally undercut the momentum of the track as a whole. Slaptivism and Titan come to mind. Also wasn't huge on Pasta Masta as a whole, or its rap feature from The Whittler, but I wouldn't say any of it gets to a bothersome extent or I ever feel a strong urge to skip tracks. The worst parts are just fine. Bigger highlights include the almost lo-fi hip-hop adjacent Golden Gate, the strong vocal hook on Too Complicated, the more banger-centric beats of Loaf Boy and Shepherding YouTube. Do quite like the drum and bass flavor of the latter. Also the more chill but highly detailed explorations of Pastel, Screening Part 2, and Glilchake. It's all very solid stuff for what it is. Would definitely recommend giving it a shot if this style is your thing. Not bad, to quote one track. Feeling a 7.7 out of 10 on this. Next up from Flight Facilities, Forever. Alright, I've been mildly interested in this Australian house duo ever since I saw one of my regular commenters mark their first album from 2014, Down to Earth, as his personal favorite of all time, full stop. I don't remember whether or not he specifically recommended it to me, but with the release of this follow-up, I still wanted to try it out of curiosity. And after hearing it, I can in fact co-sign it is pretty damn great. Really nice blend of deep house, disco, jazz, soul, and more that all stays very low-key. It's pretty commercial sounding, but never to the point of feeling watered down. Well-paced, well-varied, consistently good hooks. Ran on an hour without feeling like it. Really don't have much to complain about it. Obviously, it's not going to rank among my personal favorites of all time, especially since I've only listened to it once. But it could probably land somewhere in 8 out of 10 territory for me. I was quite impressed by it. That said, this follow-up 7 years later, not gonna lie, I found it to be kind of underwhelming in comparison. While all the ingredients that made Down to Earth work are also here to some extent, everything seems executed in a lesser way than on that album. It feels fleshed out enough, but not as well fleshed out as their debut. It's got decent variety, but not as much variety as their debut. The hooks are all pretty good, but they're not nearly as good as on the debut. Heck, the hooks in particular, I think maybe the elements that I was the most disappointed by. All of them are pretty catchy. I feel like they all wore out their welcome faster, and the female backing singers that show up on nearly every track kind of start to wear out on me and make the experience feel less dynamic or varied, I guess. Now, sure, a lot of the cuts on Down to Earth also ran on kind of long and were somewhat repetitive, and the ones on here tend to be shorter on average, but they also felt longer, for whatever reason, and the ones on Down to Earth didn't feel long. It's really hard to pin down, like the entire thing just feels like a weaker imitation of what they've done before. With that said, there are still moments here that work for me. Generally any of the most up-tempo moments work the best, like the opener, Lights Up with Channel Trace was a banger. The Ghost had some solid acid grooves, even if I wasn't big on the robotic vocals. And Move was probably my favorite cut in the bunch. Hardest hitting house beats, best bass lines and grooves. The lyrics may have hit me somewhere in between Moby's I Love to Move in Here and that I Like to Move It song from Madagascar. But whatever, still really liked it. Stay was probably my favorite of the atmospheric ballady cuts, and I like the jazzier tones of Heavy, too. While Crave You on their last album was probably the better song overall, that track, in context, struck me as a somewhat abrupt and arbitrary closer. Having this cut much earlier in the album, that is better placed. Does work to its benefit. But that's about it. The rest I was just kind of ambivalent on. Like, if you did really love their first album, you'll probably enjoy this one as well. It delivers a lot of what made that album work, but I personally found this to be a letdown in comparison. I'll just hang on to Down to Earth and stick to that. This is probably just getting a 6.5 out of 10 for me. Next up from Gas, Der Lange Marsch. Damn, and here was me thinking that that John Oliver project was going to be the only Forest-themed ambient project I'd be covering in this roundup. check that one out too. That guy's probably going to get overlooked. But anyway, yeah, I had no idea GRiZ was going to be releasing a new album this year until literally the night before it dropped, but I'll definitely take it. It sounds exactly like what you would expect if you've heard any previous GRiZ album. Same monolithic orchestral samples with minimal techno beats plotting and marching throughout the entire running time. Though, as usual, there is definitely a feel to this album to set it apart from the other GRiZ albums. For one thing, it's probably the most triumphant sounding GRiZ album. The orchestral arrangements feel like they're a lot lusher and maybe even happier than the usual from him, with a lot more brass and woodwind. Even if there are plenty of sections that lean on a more dissonant and stormier sound, it's still not nearly as comforting a listen as Pop. It's one of the most monolithic GRiZ albums to date as well. While there is some minor progression and variation between the piece's 11 sections, like the trumpets coming in during part 5 and switching over into some way stormier and more dissonant woodwind arrangements in part 6, the wailing choirs and pianos in part 10, the direct callback to the first movement of Pop on part 8, etc. But the techno beat is a constant, unchanging presence, like you're listening to these melted orchestral recordings next to a running washing machine, which is not actually a complaint, it's a cool effect. It all blends into the same piece that feels like it least calls for being broken up into parts than any other GRiZ album, while still keeping your attention all the way through. Or at least it would if not for those fade-outs. Yeah, I bought this album on Bandcamp, and Voight made the very irritating decision to make each individual part fade out at the end, but still start with really abrupt hard cuts. It makes every single transition between each track laughably jarring and immersion-breaking. He did mercifully also include a much-needed continuous mix of the album as a bonus in the Bandcamp download, and I'm probably going to stick to that. But still, come on man, please just hard-cut the end of tracks if you're going to do a continuous mix like that. You can't even stream it directly off the Bandcamp page without paying first, and for the official paid download to be in that state is kinda inexcusable. Regardless of that irritating tidbit, Der Lange Marsch is yet another rock-solid addition to the GRiZ catalog that further deepens his legacy, and I will have to give it a 7.7 out of 10. Next up from Kelbin, EFYL. Alright, Kelbin is an 18-year-old modular synth artist from Italy who I'd never heard of previously, and I randomly got a blind recommendation from a commenter to check out. They look interesting. I bought their album on Bandcamp, and they were really excited about that, so yeah, that was cool. And this album is really freaking solid, too! Sonically, I'd say this falls somewhere among the big epic melodic work explored by upscale artists. Sakura Burst's Deconstructing Nature and parts of Aleph's Ego Death most readily come to mind. Though there's apparently some inspiration taken from the likes of Amon Tobin. I think I heard a direct sample from Fear and a Handful of Dust at one point. And I could hear some peak period Ultimate Records influence in there, like Asura and carbon-based Lifeforms and stuff like that. Now, Kelbin does market themselves on making modular music in its most sincere and unpretentious form. And, okay, sincere absolutely, but unpretentious, not the word I would use. Whenever I use the word unpretentious, I use it to describe stuff that feels casual, less serious, smaller scale, lower key. Stuff that's not trying to go out of its way to prove anything, lacking pretense. And that doesn't really describe Kelbin. They are trying to sound big and impressive. They've named a track Noise Temple What Does Sound Look Like? That immediately brought the I Can Hear in Color samples on Aleph's Ego Death. Now, this album obviously isn't nearly on that album's level of pretense. Kelbin isn't self-aggrandizing or even attempting any kind of greater concept with this thing. And I do want to make it clear, there is nothing wrong with pretense. It is not inherently a bad thing, and for the most part it'll only become a problem if you overdo it and big yourself up to the point of promising more than you can deliver. And, I mean, aside from that one descriptor in that Bandcamp not feeling accurate to me, Kelbin does not have that problem. They are very much succeeding in their attempts to sound big and impressive. This stuff just sounds fantastic and feels like the kind of thing I'd expect out of a much higher profile artist. Super well detailed and well balanced, and they absolutely have the deeper emotional core to back themselves up. I suppose I don't really have much to say from like an individual track basis. A lot of these tracks have kind of the same sort of ideas behind them, albeit built out of different textures. Some cuts have faster beats, influenced by garage or drum and bass, some try a more ambient approach. My favorite one was probably the closer with Dearest Alex that has those really nice piano progressions. But all these tracks are good. The interludes don't even feel out of place or skippable either. I don't know if this is going to be your endless material. Starting to run out of room on that list at this point of the year, and it's not the most mind-blowing stuff I've ever heard in this mold. I think there's a lot of room to even further expand upon these kinds of ideas and put out something that could be even more impressive. But this still shows a heck of a lot of promise and absolutely deserves more attention than it's getting, so go check it out. I can let this get away with a solid 8 out of 10. And finally, from James Blake, Friends That Break Your Heart. And I can't believe I'm still... Alright, in the last volume I finished with an artist that lies a lot more on the fringe of what qualifies as electronic music while being a major inspiration to many further within the genre, and I'd gotten a number of requests to cover before. So now I'm doing that again. I've obviously known about James Blake for a long time and how influential he is to the experimental pop and glitch pop side of this genre. Even if I know he's moved a lot more towards alternative R&B and pop in the last couple of years, he definitely has a background in electronic music. I mean, his first couple of EPs were on R&S Records. But I'd only ever properly listened to his first album, like, once years ago, and never really came back to it, and I hadn't gotten around to hearing anything else. So I wanted to finally catch myself up on his other stuff and pin down some actual opinions on him. I went back and listened to his previous albums. Here's my thoughts on those. This is one of those projects that in hindsight probably just straight up qualifies as a classic, the way all his experiments in vocal manipulation and super stripped back glitch pop that eventually turned into bedroom pop and saw its ideas being copied lots of times over by lots of different artists, both small time and mainstream. Its widespread influence is undeniable. On a personal level, it's a pretty good album, but not one that I ever felt strongly either way about or felt the need to come back to much. This one is an improvement across the board, much more of an expansion in sound, showing a lot more variety and versatility, both more emotionally resonant performances and occasionally more experimental sound design too. Still think this album is only pretty solid, and not sure if it's a long-time keeper, but I can see why this is consistently picked as people's favorite album of his. I remember this one getting a lot more mixed reviews when it came out, and I will not deny it is a way more long-winded experience than his last two, but I still generally liked it. I basically put it on and treated it as an ambient project, still got my fair share of standouts, think it is a quite deep exploration into depression. I don't love it either, but it is up to his usual standards. Well, this one's list of guest features is pretty damn stacked. Andre 3000, what the heck. And the whole project does noticeably have more of a mainstream accessible hip-hop flavor than any of his previous ones. And it might be my favorite of all of them up to this point. Just happen to have a bit more life and texture in it than a lot of his older stuff while not sacrificing any of his previous musical identity. So I guess I generally like James Blake. He is definitely not among the most attention-grabbing artists I've ever heard, and I don't think he has any albums I love. Though I do definitely understand his appeal and at least liked all of these albums. He has always firmly stuck to more subtle territory, and maybe some projects could be growers if I spent more time with them, I don't know. But now that brings us to this latest album, which some people have found disappointing and others say is one of his best. It's definitely his most traditional pop project to date, still going over minimal synth projects or chopped up samples, but not nearly getting as glitchy or experimental in some of his earlier work. He's really not operating within my typical review boundaries at all anymore, but oh well, I already committed to writing this segment. Anyway, I thought this album was pretty nice, if fairly misshapen and inconsistent. This album is at its best when Blake is just detailing his own personal angst and sadness and whatever other negative feelings he's stewing in. He always really sells it, sounds just as pained as his lyrics paint him to be. Famous last words, Life Is Not the Same, and Coming Back were all beautiful sounding tearjerkers that had me fully pulled in. All the easy highlights on here, and the main reason I would ever see myself coming back to this. So then we get Funeral, which is carried by Blake's performance, but isn't nearly as instrumentally investing. And after that point, the whole album kind of derails and loses focus. I liked Frozen with Jid and Suave and their energetic rap verses and weird storytelling, but it has absolutely no business being included on this particular album. I'm So Blessed You're Mine has some good melodies, but that one pitched up sample as its hook sounded goofy and didn't really work. Foot Forward has a cool lo-fi piano loops I liked, but the Metro Boomin producer tag at the beginning caught me off guard, made me laugh, and prevented me from getting into the rest of it as much as I wanted. Show Me showed Blake doing a duet with Monica Martin, and I just I don't know, I just wasn't really pulled into that one. The last third goes back into Blake's personal demons, and all have really solid lyrics and performances, which are often tragically self-deprecating and intentionally insecure, both about his relationships and his own place in the industry to which he feels very much disposable to, resigning to his fate of having the lifespan of a meteor shower on Say What You Will. Oof. That did in fact kind of get to me. But I'm kind of iffy on how those cuts play out instrumentally. All their hooks kind of leave me detached, and their backdrops all feel a little awkward and kind of off. Especially like those church organs on the closer, which didn't really fit next to the synth backdrops of the rest of the track. Though I did really like the title track. The acoustic guitar loop on that one reminds me of Air's Sex-Born Poison. It's a shame, I really wanted to get into this more based on the promise of those opening 3 tracks, which again were all great. The rest of it just kind of trails off and kind of leaves me feeling like this isn't one of his better projects overall. I will have to give him credit for pulling me in as much as he did in those best moments though, and I even enjoyed his presence in his worst moments and think he did successfully translate his pain into music and made it sound very real, so I guess I'm feeling a 6.7 out of 10. It's not bad, just not as good as it could have been. And that's a weirdly ambivalent note to leave us out on, but that's it. That's the end of the roundup. Of course, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list? Link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.